How do you have budget stewardship? How do you, focus on performance, but also like where can you begin and then how do you expand responsibly? Hello and welcome to the Marketing Architects, a research-first podcast dedicated to answering your toughest marketing questions. I'm Elena. I run the marketing team here at Marketing Architects, and I'm joined by my two co-hosts, Angela Voss, our CEO, Rob DeMars, our Chief Creative Officer, along with a very special guest, Dan Cleveland, our VP of Strategy.
Dan, I heard something about you yesterday. Is it true that you hiked into the Grand Canyon twice?
Yes. Well, MA has a real passion for parks, as we all know, and that's been my version of it is Grand Canyon.
Got it. So, as a bit of a numbers guy, do you run the probabilities in advance of these hikes on the likelihood of emerging from the canyon?
I think a lot of hikers in the Grand Canyon do a little math on the probabilities of survival. Well, the thing is, there's about 2% of the people that get below the rim. So there's a pretty big distinction between those that visit the canyon from a sightseeing perspective versus those that dive in, and it's really more of an adventure type of experience. So, there's a little bit of on the line.
Did they offer the VR headset version? Because that's
for the rest of us that
in the visitor
stay
station.
Above the rim.
Well, if you want, certain treadmills do have Grand Canyon hikes on their video option.
But then you'd still have to exercise.
Yeah. Well, you could just let the thing run, but yeah.
I think that's more my style.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dan, for the Grand Canyon probabilities. That's why we have you here today. We are back today with Dan and our thoughts on some recent marketing news. Again, always trying to root our opinions in data, research, and what drives business results. So today we're going to be answering a question that came in from a listener. Quick reminder, if you have a question for us, please submit it at marketingarchitects.com/podcast. And this question came from Sam. He shared a link to a recent article in MarketingWeek by Mark Ritson. It's called "Even Sophisticated Mass Marketers Need Targeting." And he asked if we could cover it on the show, so that's what we're going to do. And I will kick us off, as I always do, by summarizing the article. So Ritson, he starts off by talking about the marketing industry's newfound love for mass marketing, which, as we know, has been popularized by the Ehrenberg Bass Institute and others. I think we've all noticed this shift. It's a big reason why TV, a channel that we specialize in, has become popular once again. So Ritson goes on to say that this has caused a shift away from what was becoming an obsession with tight targeting. Again, a trend that we generally support on this podcast. However, he goes on to point out that this doesn't mean targeting everyone. He talks about the need for sophisticated mass marketing, which, according to him, does not simply mean, quote, targeting everyone with a pulse. The prefix sophisticated means that marketers first have to identify the total potential market and make that their target, not simply advertise to the whole population. So Ritson, he uses P&G as an example. They sell products like toilet paper, detergent, and toothpaste. So if any brand has a reason to target the whole population, it's P&G. To Mark Pritchard, P&G's chief brand officer, his potential market and the total population are pretty much one and the same, you would think. He might as well target everyone. But it's not that simple. Ritson makes the point that even if a brand subscribes to the sophisticated mass marketing belief, they are going to face a challenge when it comes to that word, sophisticated. This sophistication requires a definition of who is and who isn't in the market for your product. One example he gives is mortgages. Is the market everyone who owns a home, everyone who wants to own a home? So his main point is that signing up for sophisticated mass marketing, it doesn't make marketing simple or mean that you don't have to learn how to identify and target your audience. And to illustrate just how difficult this is, he gives the example of Pampers. We've all seen the Pampers commercials. They invest a lot in mass marketing. However, they have struggled with targeting. Pampers reached 70% of American parents, but only 5% of households in the, quote, diapering phase. Today, in response, Ritson said that they're focused on using first-party data and more advanced targeting to reach, quote, diapering households. Another point that he makes is that while you can prove how targeting the whole market is going to drive success, and more marketers today than ever before believe in the power of reach and brand, most brands simply can't afford to do this, so they have to learn how to deploy sophisticated mass marketing and learn how to mass market to a more defined segment of buyers who are currently in market for their products, or at least start here and then scale. And finally, a challenge Ritson brings forward is just the ability alone of brands and agencies to define this target. He suggests that this is really difficult, which is something a certain guest today has a different take on, so I'm excited to get into that in a bit. But first, there's a lot to talk about here. I think a good place to start might be just clarifying our own beliefs about mass marketing. So Ange, I'd love to kick it over to you first. What do you think about the article, and does this sophisticated mass marketing belief align with our own as an agency?
I love my kids a lot, but I'm really happy to be out of the diapering household phase of my life. So that made me giggle. I really like Mark. I think he's a great writer. For the most part, I think so, in terms of our beliefs and the article. Dan, the Grand Canyon hiker, is really the expert today on how we look at defining a consumer target. And so I'm going to let him have the mic on that. But I did want to call out that I really think marketers have a key strategic growth opportunity when it comes to mass media. With the growth of digital, it becomes really easy to slip into a trap of hyper-honed messages delivered on a one-to-one basis. And I think that ability starts to sort of freak people out about mass marketing. You know, what will we do with all of the waste we hear and we read? And waste, I think, could be an entire podcast episode, so we probably don't want to go too deep. But this idea of waste should really be considered positive spill when you think about mass marketing. You know, assuming you've done your due diligence in understanding your consumer and that in and out of market mix, your targeting, and the positive spill effect it has with the mass channel, that hits purchase influencers. We don't make buying decisions in a vacuum. There's those around us that really influence kind of what we choose to buy. And then, of course, those future buyers as well. Now, as a brand, you may need to consider what is your allowable cost for a spill impression as compared to, you know, kind of that target market or that core. But those are just considerations that, you know, we should be making when we think about media planning and the right cost associated with those impression deliveries. Rob, I think about some of the brands that we've worked with, and we've really seen mass channels like TV widen the growth vehicles for brands, right? Like, maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll have to start off with a hypothetical question, which is, how much stuff can you stuff in a stuffy till your stuffy's stuffed enough stuff? Which was a jingle for a stuffed animal that we launched into television, which really begged the question of how much reach can you stuff into a stuffy until you've reached enough of the audience? Mm-hmm. And that was a question we were pondering. We're marketing a stuffed animal, which, you know, naturally you could go, wow, you could hit the entire universe. Like, what house wouldn't want to have a stuffed animal? But obviously that would be highly inefficient. So then you go to the other side of the coin and you go, well, let's just target kids, right? Like, mm-hmm. That's the audience. That's who's going to buy this stuff. Mm-hmm. You know, perhaps a secondary audience and co-viewing when moms are watching the commercials. But it was interesting because we did some pretty bold message testing just to try out some other audiences in television and realized that grandmas were highly responsive to the purchase of a stuffed animal, in particular for stuffies. And really, they saw the value of being seen as a hero for knowing what their grandchildren would like. So mm-hmm. we were able to expand our audience to a really nice sweet spot of, you know, hitting both kids, but also messages targeting grandmas, which was really a surprise to us, and that's why we love to test and learn, and you know, really found the right reach for the Stuffies audience.
Right, Rob, I think Stuffies are a perfect example of sophisticated mass marketing and how we found that right audience. And with that in mind, I think it might be helpful for listeners if we walk through how do we practically go about that as a TV agency. The result was we knew that we should hit, you know, grandmas, but how did we get there? So for our clients, it all starts with the right strategy. We have a whole strategy department that's really dedicated to positioning brands for success on a mass marketing channel like TV. And that leads me to my first question for our guest. We brought Dan here today because he helps our clients define and target their audience with a marketing channel, TV, that is not traditionally known for its targeting capabilities. So Dan, I'd love to kick it over to you. How do you help marketers clarify their audience?
First, if I was just to challenge a little bit in the article, this whole notion of not understanding your target market is something that I would argue is hard to defend that not understanding it is the right move or the right play. Rob, to your example of stuffies, even if you didn't have all of the tools available that we have right now, back then, there was a passion for learning. There's a passion for understanding who are these responders and a sense of wanting to learn as you go. I would argue even in the absence of a lot of different tools, brands still have the opportunities to learn. So we do our own primary and secondary research, even without sophisticated and higher investment tools that allow us to understand who are these people that are likely coming back, coming to our brand and coming back to our brand. So from just a general premise, I find it hard to understand why you wouldn't do that. The other piece about why not is that it's not just about media. A lot of it's also about how do you engage the right consumers. So when you think about what the target audience definitions help you understand is what segments of the population or of the target do you think we should be going after first and hardest. So it gives a sense for messaging and understanding how to position the brand and the proposition. So back to your point, Elena, about the practicality piece, we use tools like MRI Simmons that gives us a chance to see a lot of range of information available about who a target audience could be. So we typically start with looking at motivators and abilities to buy a certain type of product. So what kinds of needs do people have, and what's their ability to actually execute or deliver on those needs with their own purchasing power. That allows us to really understand who the real players are. So, one of the great comments that this leads to, Angela, is your comment on spill. So how do you make smart spill, or how do you lean in a direction that stays away from waste? A lot of it is to understand who are those people that have those motivations and potential abilities, and then we skew our buying methods towards areas that we think are more highly populated with people that are going to be valuable influencers or people that are likely influencers. So understanding that audience, understanding who makes it up, and understanding the people within their realms, like that next band of influence, gives us a chance to understand areas where to lean into and maybe areas where to lean away from that help us make sure that our incremental investments have more positive outcomes.
So Dan, you started off by talking about just the piece of the article that said that brands are having trouble defining their target audience. And when we were talking before the podcast, you mentioned one of the stats from the article, which was that it was a Better Briefs analysis of British client briefs. And they said that 62% of briefs did not clearly define who the target was for the campaign. And you had some thoughts on that. So I'd love to hear, what did you think about that statistic?
Yeah, that's hard to. I find it at first knee-jerk. It's hard to believe that that's a true stat, and I'm curious, what is the foundation that they're working from? And I think that's the essence of some of the challenge with this article for me is that it doesn't take a lot of effort, and the tools are easily. Or there's a lot of access to tools or information that allows you to start getting information about your consumer, and then even to make sure you're plugged into what's happening from a response standpoint. And I think that's another component that that MA, that's part of our DNA, is really measure everything that can be measured, and a lot of that leads then to an understanding as to who and where and through what channels people are coming in, and all of that together starts to build this foundation or base of knowledge that can be used to do some of the things we talked about maintaining and growing efficiencies. Right.
And speaking of using tools to figure out who your audience is, I also, when we were talking before the show, we started discussing, which I didn't think we ever would on the podcast, this idea of diapering households and the fact that P&G, they hit 70% of households, according to the article, but only 5% of those were quote-unquote diapering households. And Dan, I'd love to hear what you think about those stats as well.
Yeah, when you start to think about that math and how can you hit 70% of households and miss that many diapering households, that's the math is tough to kind of think through. But I think part of what this leads to is finding the right tools for the right tasks from a media standpoint. And, Ange, to your points earlier about finding people in market, that may be one of the challenges, is that they're finding families with kids, but they're not finding families with kids that are below a certain age. So when you look at that distinction, understanding that part of the audience and how to reflect that into how you look at media, in what types of media, and I would dare say the word streaming would come into play at this point, even as an option or as a complement. That laying down a very efficient layer of linear is oftentimes our best approach, and we find that and test that, and that turns out to be true in virtually every instance. But this could be an example where hopefully what they're doing with their first party data is they're starting to look for streaming opportunities that find people that they know are very timely or in market buying at this moment relative to that kind of product or that kind of need state. So they can get around this difference between a family with kids versus a family with diapering kids, which, from a third-party data standpoint isn't always a very easy distinction. And then obviously that information ages, and you can obviously age out of that particular need state.
Yeah, I've never been in the diapering phase personally, but I wonder how much media are you consuming when you're in the diapering phase in general? I would think you'd be pretty preoccupied.
Yeah, and that's another part of the stat is they don't talk about reach of people, prior, during, and post that particular event. So when you think about, where does smart spill go, positive spill, would always, would want to go towards areas where people are, potentially entering the market or becoming more likely buyers. So, that's again, knowing your marketplace and knowing your target audience gives you a chance to essentially stage a journey experience or be part of the journey experience to get those young couples, those, very early parents aware of, the reasons to choose your brand before they're actually in the, before the game is on and they are, all hands on deck, so to speak.
The other thing I think about too, Dan, is, for a brand like Pampers, where you've got, diapers on shelves, and it's primarily being purchased through brick and mortar retail, some Amazon shopping, I'm sure, but not a lot of direct traffic probably to pampers.com. Is if you are a brand where, the majority of your traffic is coming directly to you and you've got e-commerce sales happening, is leveraging response data to be a little bit of a gut check on the targeting that you've put out there. Now those are, response that you're going to get kind of in the moment or days, weeks after. Those are your in-market consumers. And of course, those out-of-market consumers are very important as well. So we don't want to lean all the way into being too over-reliant on that sales activation and what it can mean for your business in the short term. But being able to see where response is coming from and does it kind of marry up against some of the MRI data that maybe you leverage to put that media plan in place is a good strategy. Would you agree? Anything more that you would suggest there?
I would agree with that. The other piece that, when you think of the challenge you have of people that are buying through brick and mortar, some of the other tools that we leverage internally would be some of our research studies. And some of those get into, how people are actually going through the process of deciding and purchasing a product. And that gives us an additional layer or additional opportunity to understand what types of messaging and what types of impressions are making their way through and making a difference.
If you're a marketer, you already know TV advertising is powerful, but launching TV is not exactly easy. That's why Marketing Architects rebuilt TV advertising to help brands drive profitable growth. Introducing All-Inclusive TV, a revolutionary approach to TV advertising where all you pay for is media. Marketing Architects provides everything else needed for success, from stunning creative to results you can trust. Visit marketingarchitects.com to learn more. Well, speaking of performance, Dan, when we were talking about this, you mentioned part of the article, they sort of express not reaching your whole category as a failure, but you pointed out that there are some cases where you might not want to reach everybody. You might want to focus on those people that are most likely to buy from you. And we were giving the example of when you're trying to win a presidential election, you don't visit every single town, right? You visit the towns where you think you can get votes. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and that goes back, Andrew was mentioning some comments about efficiencies, and the way we typically look at it is what's the incremental cost for obtaining that incremental reach? And from a performance marketer standpoint, that's a critical equation to continually run. So we are typically looking at saturation curves and things related to how much spend and what our targeting is doing from a reach standpoint, and making sure that those incremental reach gains are actually proving out in market to be positive investments. That we're not just looking at the overall campaign profitability, but what's that incremental investment bringing us from an incremental performance standpoint. So being able to understand or wanting to have a focus on understanding that kind of dynamic is really critical in making sure that you're able to scale to the right levels and maintain the profitability that you should be getting.
I always think too, from a targeting standpoint, it's a fun game for marketers to play. Mark Pritchard's working with $8 billion in marketing budget. So if he had 1 billion or if he had 500 million, what would the marketing plan look like is a good exercise to go through. And I think the reverse as well, like just to challenge yourself. Okay, we've got 10 million in marketing budget. What would it look like if we had 100 million, and not that you should go out and do all of those things, but it's a little bit of a good checks and balances on thinking through, are we appropriately weighting both in market demand and out of market demand, and thinking about kind of influencers of decisions and, really trying to think through what's a long-term strategy going to look like, but also how do we drive short-term as well so that we can hit the numbers we need to hit. Another
point that came up that I would say kind of just sat funny with me was this notion of having a goal of having 100% reach. So that whole notion of reaching every single person in your market or in your category is one that I would say, and you guys can jump in if you disagree, but I would say that's not necessarily part of our core belief, that we have to reach every single household regardless of cost, regardless of effort. And that's something that when you talk again about this incremental tracking of performance or investment in the performance of it, that's the example I would say would be, that's the way out there kind of idea of having to reach everybody regardless.
That would require a very large diaper to wrap that.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to go back to your fun facts, Ange, it'd be almost like, paying for a billboard at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, because there's that 1% of people that are going to make it down there and they're looking at their steps and their feet all the way down, not seeing any messaging until the end. Probably not a good investment, though.
Great analogy. I love it.
Right. And kind of tying on what you both said, what I think is also hard about the article is we are looking at P&G, which, like Ange mentioned, massive, massive marketing budgets. And they're in a little bit of a different spot than most of the marketers probably listening to this show. So, Dan, one question I had for you is we try to look at news like this and articles and break it down for any marketer, really, if we can. What would you say are some takeaways that marketers can learn from this article and the idea of sophisticated mass marketing?
I think part of it is this theme of budget stewardship, and to make sure you're making wise decisions. From a strategy perspective, obviously it's all about choices, and it's figuring out what is really the right investment level to manage a longer term strategy of growing your share in category and becoming a dominant player in your category. That's really the position we come to the table with, is trying to understand how can we take you on this journey, client, to a position where you're going to be continually improving your standing against category. So to do that, it sometimes means you're not just looking at bottom of funnel clicks. You're having to think about a plan and to have a kind of a conquest strategy from from a consumer target audience standpoint. Where can we begin? Where can we expand to? What kinds of things are necessary to allow us to do that from a messaging or from a reach or from even a mix of channels. And that's where we bring in things like streaming, where we have the ability to get more surgical and to find areas or to test into areas that maybe haven't been fully vetted through linear, but gives us a chance to understand what kind of messaging could work within this new audience group or this new need state that we haven't necessarily cracked yet.
I think one other thing that's super important to remember is how important light and super light buyers are to a brand in their ability to maintain share or grow share. And so it's very common, and it makes sense, right, for brands to kind of focus in on who's buying from us and who's buying the most from us and how do we find more of them. And that, of course, does matter, but it probably is going to limit what your growth, share and potential looks like. And so kind of getting out of that core target and going to that next kind of bullseye layer to your business is important. Those are the light and the super light buyers that can continue to fuel growth and become evangelists for your brand as well.
Yeah. And I think you and Dan are sort of talking about this same idea of how do you have budget stewardship? How do you, focus on performance, but also like where can you begin and then how do you expand responsibly? And I know that we help our clients do that by even showing them, here's how much of your audience is reachable through this channel, here's how much is reachable through that channel, and then we sort of test into it to allow them to expand and hit those super light buyers, but also do it in a performance-driven way.
Absolutely.
I'm just so proud that no other podcast in America has used the term diapering household as much as us.
We don't have a lot of accolades yet, but that is one we can add. That's it for this episode of The Marketing Architects. You can connect with us on LinkedIn, and if you find our show valuable, please leave us a rating and review. And if you want to know what the research says about some recent news, you can contact us at marketingarchitects.com/podcast. Now go forth and build great marketing.